I'm Amelia Miller, and let me tell you a story. My story. The kind they warn you about in therapy or whisper behind closed doors when someone finally snaps. I used to believe in second chances, in love, in loyalty, in building something that lasts. I wore that belief like armor, until the man I married turned out to be the very person who dismantled me. Piece by calculated piece. They say betrayal never comes from your enemies. I learned that the hard way when the person sleeping beside me stole more than just my trust. He took my name, my credit, my safety. But I wasn't just a wife. I wasn't just a paycheck. I was a cybersecurity architect, trained to detect threats, even the ones hiding behind a smile. When Douglas thought he was being clever, siphoning off my life one transaction at a time, he didn't realize he was walking straight into the kind of trap I built for corporations. And now? Now, this isn't about revenge. This is about reclaiming what's mine. My freedom, my name, my future. So sit down, listen closely, because everything you're about to hear is real. It happened. And if you've ever trusted the wrong person, you'll understand why I had to burn it all down, just to rebuild from the ash. He stole everything but forgot I built the trap he walked into. His name is Douglas Miller. On the surface, he was the perfect partner. Charming, articulate, just ambitious enough to get by without ever doing much. He knew how to play the part. And I, ever the optimist, played mine, the wife who worked late, brought home the paycheck, and kept the lights on while he chased one groundbreaking idea after another. But charm without consistency is a con, and dreams without discipline are just distractions. It took me 7 years to admit what deep down I always knew. I wasn't his partner. I was his bank, his crutch, his convenience. The final straw came quietly. Just a notification on my phone one morning as I sipped my coffee in our sleek, overly sterile apartment in downtown Seattle. A charge for a first-class flight to Paris. Minutes later, another for a designer boutique in Le Marais. Then another, and another. Nearly $50,000, 0 cents, gone overnight. But here's the twist. I didn't panic. I didn't cry. I smiled. Because the card he'd used wasn't tied to my personal finances, it was a controlled training tool. One I'd created as part of a fraud detection simulation for a Fortune 500 client. A dummy card connected to a real-time alert system monitored by federal cybersecurity partners. Douglas hadn't just stolen from me, he'd walked straight into a federal sting. And he had no idea. The night before those alerts hit my phone, I'd gone to bed early after hours of configuring automated fraud protocols. Douglas said he was working late on a pitch deck. I should have known better. He never worked late. But I'd trained myself to ignore inconsistencies. It's what happens when survival becomes a habit. You stop asking questions even when everything screams for answers. I remember hearing the faint click of the laptop lid downstairs sometime after midnight. Light footstep, a quick snap of a phone camera. Then silence. I laid there with my eyes closed, pretending to sleep, my pulse steady. If you've ever had your trust broken, slowly, day after day, you'll know what I mean when I say the worst part isn't the lie. It's realizing how long you've allowed yourself to believe it. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen counter in my robe, fingers curled around a mug of dark roast. Douglas strolled in like he was auditioning for a fragrance ad, tailored blazers slung carelessly over one shoulder, new sunglasses still bearing the plastic lens sticker. "Thanks for the upgrade, babe," he said, dropping his keys beside the French press. Paris was transformative. I didn't blink. Must have been. He kissed me on the cheek, oblivious to the fact that my phone, hidden beneath a magazine, was vibrating with every new alert the dummy card triggered. He took a shower. I opened my encrypted notes app. Evidence. Day 1, transaction total, $47,839.18. Pattern, consistent with unauthorized access protocol. Suspect, Douglas Miller. Status unknown. By the time he emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in hotel-grade linen and humming a Sinatra tune, I had already emailed Chloe Whitmore, my lawyer, my confidant, and the one person I trusted without reservation. He's back. We moved tonight. Douglas had always been predictable. Predictable in the way lazy men often are. Just clever enough to manipulate, just careless enough to get caught. He lounged on the couch in his robe, scrolling through photos of his European escapade, humming some obnoxious melody under his breath. From time to time, he'd glance over at me like he expected admiration, like I should have been proud of what he'd achieved. "I got you something," he said, reaching into his designer duffel bag like a magician unveiling a cheap trick. Out came a gleaming gold watch, still tagged. "Limited edition," he added, like that meant something. "You should have seen the boutique in Paris. It had this velvet wall just for their exclusive line. The saleswoman said it would look stunning on my wrist." I smiled faintly. "Of course she did," he chuckled, missing the disdain buried in my tone. "You always say I don't finish things. Well, I finished this. This trip changed me, Amelia." He was proud of the money he thought he finessed out of me, proud of himself for finally living like the men he envied. He had no idea each of those transactions had set off federal-level alarms. No idea his name, passport, and location had been flagged and logged. No idea the camera in the apartment had been silently recording this entire conversation, feeding every word straight into a backup server Chloe helped me set up. And he really had no idea that the very software he used to grab the card credentials had been planted by me months ago, coded specifically to mimic vulnerability while transmitting every keystroke. "Next time," he said, stretching like a man who believed he was untouchable, "you should come with me. You'd love the rooftop at Le Jules Verne. Breathtaking view of the Eiffel Tower." "I'm sure it is," I said, sipping my now cold coffee. He paused, narrowed his eyes. "You're being quiet." "I'm listening," I replied, taking it all in. He leaned forward. "You're not mad, are you?" I looked at him, really looked. And for the first time in years, I saw the man for what he was, a coward dressed in charm, a thief in a tailored jacket, a child who thought deception was strategy. "No, Douglas," I said. "I'm not mad. I was meticulous, calculated, focused, and I was about to be free." That evening, once he finally passed out on the couch with a half-empty glass of scotch in hand, I stood by the window, phone in one hand, server dashboard open on my laptop. Every alert, every log, every transfer from that dummy account was time-stamped, geolocated, and categorized. The evidence was airtight. I drafted the report, attached the logs, highlighted the critical entries, then hit send to Agent Raymond Keller. It was done. Douglas snored in the background, unbothered, unaware that the life he thought he'd stolen was collapsing in real time. The next morning, he was back to his smug self, complimenting the espresso, asking if I'd like to upgrade my wardrobe too. I nodded silently, already knowing he'd be interrupted soon enough. When he left for a supposed meeting at a co-working space he never really used, I opened a secure drive one last time to upload the audio files. It was then I noticed something I hadn't logged. A hidden folder, encrypted. Not mine. The name. Face 2. I hesitated, then cracked the encryption using a back door I'd created for just such surprises. Inside were 2 files. An audio recording, Douglas speaking to someone, not me. A short text document titled Plan B JL. I pressed play. Douglas's voice, low and sly. "She's too smart to fall for anything simple, but if we time it right, Jessica can trigger the fallback. By the time Amelia catches on, we'll have what we need." Jessica Lane, my friend, my only real friend. The person who toasted my divorce plan 2 weeks ago over wine. The one who hugged me the night I filed for separation. The one who said, "You're stronger than he thinks." The betrayal hit colder than anything Douglas had done. And suddenly I realized this wasn't over. This had never been just about him. He called it an upgrade, I called it evidence. The day after I found the Phase 2 folder, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling while the pieces rearranged themselves in my mind like a corrupted jigsaw puzzle. Jessica Lane, my confidant, my witness, my safe place. Or so I thought. I replayed the recording 3 times before the disbelief could settle into something more dangerous, resolve. Douglas was never bright enough to pull something like this off on his own. Of course he had help. Of course it would be someone I'd never suspect. Jessica knew the layout of my life, where I kept my backups, how I organized client firewalls, which passwords I changed and which ones I never bothered to. She knew about the dummy card too. Not in full detail, only the gist. I had mentioned it once over drinks, laughing about how elaborate some of my company's fraud detection simulations were. I'd even joked, honestly, if someone used it, they'd set off a federal investigation within 5 minutes. She laughed with me that night. A little too hard, now that I think back on it. Now I wasn't laughing, I was calculating. By mid-morning, I had shut off the emotional part of my brain. I opened a secure channel with Chloe. No small talk, no pleasantries. I sent the audio file, the metadata, and a simple message. He wasn't alone. I need you to check Jessica Lane. While waiting for her reply, I walked to a cafe downtown, the kind with minimalist furniture and overpriced croissants, where no one makes eye contact, but everyone notices everything. I needed public noise to drown out the private chaos. That's when Jessica called. "Hey," she chirped, far too cheerful. "You okay? You kinda ghosted yesterday." My hand tightened around the coffee cup. "Yeah, just processing everything with Douglas. The arrest, the aftermath," she hummed sympathetically. "Honestly, you're a saint. I would have decked him and set fire to his suits." I let out a dry laugh. "Tempting?" She lowered her voice. "Have you told anyone else about the card? Or how you set it all up?" "No, just you," I said quietly. "Why?" There was the briefest pause, almost imperceptible. "Just wondering how long you'd been planning it. You're kind of a genius, you know?" I didn't answer. She was fishing. The call ended with her usual "love you, mean it," and a quick mention of drinks later in the week. I agreed, smiling into the phone, and then blocked her number. By the time I got back to the apartment, Chloe had responded. Her name is nowhere in any legal documentation related to Douglas, but she used to work freelance with a startup Douglas pitched to last year. The email attached to the project, jlane@redhawkstrategy.com. Want me to dig deeper? I stared at the screen. Yes. Dig until there's no ground left. That evening, I poured a glass of wine, lit a cinnamon candle, and opened the drive where I kept archived backups of all my previous firewall projects, contracts, test runs, backend mirrors. Buried in a 2021 folder under a project titled Monarch Beta was a string of IP logs with user notes in my handwriting. One IP stood out. It didn't belong to Douglas. It belonged to someone who accessed the system after the dummy card was triggered, someone with admin credentials identical to mine, Jessica Lane. I sat back, feeling my heart pound for the first time all day. She hadn't just helped Douglas. She had entered my professional environment, crossed the boundary between personal betrayal and professional sabotage. Which meant this wasn't just about ego or money. This was about erasing me. It's one thing to be betrayed by your husband. It's another thing entirely when the person who stabs you in the back also held your hand while you dressed the wound. Jessica wasn't just a friend. She was part of my recovery after the first time Douglas screwed up. She was the one who brought over takeout when I had back-to-back deadlines, the one who texted me inspirational quotes when I cried in silence over a marriage I couldn't admit was failing. And now I realized she was always watching. Taking notes, learning my rhythms, and apparently mimicking my access. That night, I ran a full audit of every system I had built over the past 24 months. Most of it came up clean, but tucked into one specific client sandbox, a multi-state health tech project. I'd found a line of code that wasn't mine. It looked nearly identical to my own structuring, but just off enough for me to spot it. Jessica had tried to replicate me. She'd done a decent job, enough to fool an intern or a lazy IT reviewer, but I wasn't either of those things. I knew my own fingerprint. And hers smelled of desperation. I scheduled a call with Chloe first thing the next morning. She's not just complicit, I told her. She's embedded. There's code, Chloe. I can match timestamps, access logs, even IP behavior that syncs with her old firm's network. Chloe didn't even blink. We loop Keller in. This just became federal again. By noon, Agent Keller had a briefing folder in hand and a quiet kind of fury in his voice. She used admin-level access to breach internal systems, tied to HIPAA-regulated data. He said, that's no longer just petty revenge. That's corporate espionage. My hands tightened on the coffee cup as I stared out his office window. She was in my apartment. She drank wine from my glasses. She told me to leave Douglas. He looked at me, softer now. You don't need to carry the guilt. That's hers to drown in. I didn't cry. I didn't flinch, but something inside me hardened. We made a plan. No rash moves. No confrontation yet. We'd document everything, stack it higher than either of them could climb out from. Jessica had built a shadow profile in my system, used her proximity to learn my language, my habits, until she could forge access. But her biggest mistake wasn't copying me. It was underestimating my ability to spot the forgery. That evening, I returned home to find Douglas's duffel bag still in the hallway, untouched since the day he was arrested. Part of me wanted to burn it. Another part wanted to search it. I chose the latter. Buried beneath the clothes and receipts was a flash drive. Password protected? I smiled. He always used variations of the same password, song lyrics, sports stats, sometimes even my birthday. I tried a few, and on the third attempt, Mariners 2019, it opened. Inside, documents labeled exit strategy, asset map, and chillingly, MC collapse. It was a blueprint, not just of my finances, but of me, psychological triggers, professional weak points, notes on how to isolate me socially, emotionally, even a calendar of dates when Jessica should check in more often. It wasn't just theft, it was war. They had spent months building a manual on how to destroy me, and now I had it all. I uploaded the contents to a secure vault and created 3 backups. One to Chloe, one to Keller, one offline, air-gapped. If anything happened to me, it would surface everywhere. But it wasn't fear I felt, it was control. And then came the knock. I opened the door, expecting a delivery or a Keller with a new update. Instead, Jessica stood there, hair curled, red lipstick, eyes calm. She smiled like nothing had changed. "Hey," she said, "can we talk?" When he walked in with that grin, he didn't know the floor beneath him was already gone. The door clicked softly behind Jessica as she stepped into my apartment like nothing had shattered. Like betrayal didn't have a scent and her perfume hadn't soaked into the fabric of every lie I was still unraveling. She looked around as if surveying damage, not knowing the real explosion hadn't gone off yet. "I figured we should talk," she said, voice casual, as though we were meeting for brunch and not tiptoeing around the crater she helped dig under my life. I tilted my head, gesturing toward the couch. "Sure, let's talk." She sat carefully, crossing her legs the way she always did when she needed to appear in control. The irony didn't escape me. "I heard about Douglas," she began. "I can't believe he actually went through with it." Her tone was coated in just the right amount of disbelief to make it sound sincere. "Unless you'd heard the recording I had." And instead I lowered myself into the armchair across from her, letting the silence stretch just long enough to tighten the air between us. "Is that why you're here?" I asked. "Because you feel bad?" She blinked. Well, yeah. And because I don't know what you're going to do next." That last part was honest. It hung in the room like a dare. I almost admired her nerve. "Jessica," I said, voice steady. Do you remember the Monarch Beta project? Her eyes flicked just slightly. It was enough. I smiled. Funny thing, someone used admin credentials to breach the firewall after hours. The IP matched a node from Red Hawk Strategy. Know anyone there? She swallowed. That was years ago. So it shouldn't be in a current project, right? Silence. Just long enough to confirm everything. I trusted you, I said softly, and not just with data, with myself. You were in my home. You were my friend. Her expression faltered. Douglas made it sound like you were going to ruin him, that you were planning something vicious. I was, I replied. But not until he stole from me. Jessica stood, hands trembling slightly. I didn't think it would go that far. I thought... You thought I wouldn't figure it out? I stood too. Or that I'd be too exhausted to do anything when I did... She reached out. Amelia? I stepped back. You should go. There was a knock before she could answer. 3 sharp raps. Not the impatient kind, the prepared kind. I already knew who it was. Jessica turned toward the door, confused. I walked past her, heart drumming in measured rhythm, and opened it. Agent Raymond Keller stood there in a navy overcoat, 2 uniformed officers behind him. Good evening, Miss Miller, he said, voice smooth but firm. Is Mr. Douglas Miller inside? I paused, glanced at Jessica, her face drained of color. No, I said, but he should be any minute now. Because I had seen the notification 10 minutes ago. The access ping from his phone as he pulled into the parking garage. He was coming home, to the very trap he thought he'd outrun. Douglas always made an entrance. Even now, in the face of everything he'd triggered, he still came through the door like he owned the air inside it. Keys jingling, shoes clicking on the hardwood floor, scent of overpriced cologne trailing behind him like arrogance incarnate. I watched from the hallway just behind Agent Keller as Douglas stepped into view, immediately freezing at the sight of 3 people waiting for him, 2 in uniform, 1 with a federal badge. He blinked like he couldn't quite make sense of the tableau. What the hell is this? He said, laughing once, nervously. Amelia? You throwing me a party? Keller stepped forward. Mr. Douglas Miller, I'm Agent Raymond Keller with the Federal Cybercrimes Division. You are under investigation for multiple counts of credit card fraud, identity theft, and unauthorized use of protected financial data. The grin slipped from Douglas's face like wet paint. Jessica, standing behind me, stiffened. She hadn't said a word since the knock. Now, her arms crossed tightly, she looked like a child who'd been caught stealing from the offering plate. Douglas turned to me, his voice climbing. Amelia, what is this? You told them I did this? I stared at him, unmoving. No, Douglas. You did this. I just let the authorities know where to look. One of the officers stepped forward with cuffs. You've got to be kidding me. Douglas snapped, backing up. I'm her husband. We share accounts. She gave me permission. Tell them, Amelia. I tilted my head. You think I gave you permission to use a controlled fraud detection account? That's your defense? He faltered. I didn't know it was monitored by the federal government. Agent Keller cut in. Unfortunately for you, the moment you used that card overseas, you triggered a chain of alerts that made your location and your intent crystal clear. Douglas glanced around, seeking escape in every direction. I'm being set up, he said, louder now, angling toward Jessica. She knows. Just tell them. I was going to pay it back. I didn't know. Jessica stepped back as if scorched. You told me it was her company's dummy account, she whispered, eyes wide. You said it wasn't traceable. Douglas's face contorted. You were in on it with me. Keller raised a hand. That's enough. Mr. Miller, you're being taken in for questioning. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. As the cuffs clicked shut, Douglas turned toward me, his voice lower now, darker. You'll regret this, Amelia. You really think you've won? I stepped closer, my voice a scalpel. I didn't need to win. I just needed you to lose by your own hand. They led him out. The silence that followed was sharp. Jessica stood rigid near the kitchen, her mouth a thin line. I closed the door behind them, then turned to her. "You should go," I said. "We're done." She opened her mouth to protest, but I shook my head. "Don't make this worse than it already is." Her heels clicked across the floor like an echo of a bad decision. The door shut behind her, leaving only the thrum of the refrigerator and the slow, cold unraveling of everything I thought I knew. I stood still for a long time. Then I walked to the table, opened my laptop, and checked the secure folder again. Phase 2. There was still one document I hadn't read, one final piece titled Backup Plan, JL. I opened it. One line stared back at me. "If Amelia survives this, make sure she doesn't survive the next." He thought a plea deal would buy him peace. He didn't know it would cost him everything else. The morning after Douglas was led out in handcuffs, I found myself staring at the same kitchen window where I'd once watched him sip espresso and plan his next fantasy career. Now, I sipped alone. And this time, the silence felt like liberation, not loneliness. The document titled Backup Plan, JL, still pulsed in my mind. I hadn't shown it to anyone. Not yet. Not Keller, not Chloe. There was something about it I needed to sit with first. Needed to understand the full shape of the monster before deciding which head to cut off next. But, for now, there was paperwork. Real-world things that needed closing. At 10:00 a.m., I sat across from Chloe at her office in downtown Seattle. She looked up from her legal pad with that familiar blend of sarcasm and steel that had become her trademark. "Well," she said. "He caved." I raised an eyebrow. "Define caved." Douglas accepted the plea deal. Full restitution, court-supervised community service, and 5 years of financial monitoring. No jail time, thanks to his cooperation, mostly involving Jessica, but he loses access to all shared assets, and the court approved an immediate divorce settlement in your favor. I nodded. "So he gets to walk free?" Chloe gave me a look. "He gets to walk ruined. He'll be blacklisted from any fintech-adjacent industry. His credit's toast, the IRS is coming, and thanks to the digital forensic audit, his accounts are frozen until every cent is accounted for." It wasn't prison, but it was still a sentence. "And the divorce?" I asked. She slid a crisp folder across the table. "Filed. Judge already signed it. You're officially free, Amelia." I stared at the documents. My name. My signature. The legal death certificate of a marriage that should have expired years ago. It didn't feel victorious. It felt still. Clean. "I'm proud of you," Chloe said, her voice gentler now. "Most women wouldn't have pulled this off without losing themselves in the process." I let out a slow breath. "Most women don't have friends like you." She smiled. "Damn right." Afterward, I walked to the water near Cary Park and watched the waves batter against the rocks. My phone buzzed twice before I bothered checking it. A number I didn't recognize, but I knew who it was. I answered, already numb. "Amelia," Douglas said on the other end, voice low, like someone trying to pretend he hadn't just been gutted. "I don't have anything to say to you," I replied. "Please," he said, I didn't mean for it to go this far." That line, that tone, the same cowardice dressed up in remorse. "You meant to steal from me, Doug. You meant to lie. You meant to humiliate me. The only thing you didn't mean," I said sharply, "was getting caught." A pause. "I thought you loved me." "I did," I said, "and that's what makes you worse." I hung up. That night, I met Jessica's silence with silence of my own. No calls, no confrontation, just distance. She hadn't reached out again since showing up at my door. Maybe because she knew the next word she said would be recorded, documented, dissected. And maybe because she knew I had her cornered. But that didn't make me feel safe. Not yet. Because if Backup Plan JL was real, it meant Jessica had contingencies. Digital ones, reputational ones, maybe even legal ones. And if Douglas was desperate enough to burn me for a vacation, Jessica was capable of something far colder. So I did what I'd always done best. I prepared. That night I combed through everything. Not the financials, not the court papers or the asset disclosures. I knew those down to the decimal. I meant everything else. Emails, metadata trails, cloud syncs, archived group messages cross-referenced with Jessica's old Red Hawk account. Anything that could tell me what backup plan JL really entailed. Because I didn't believe for a second that a single plea deal had cleaned the rot. Douglas had been the performance. Jessica was the strategy, and strategies don't collapse just because one actor exits the stage. By midnight, I'd uncovered 2 emails. Nothing explicit, she was too smart for that, but something about the timestamps bothered me. Jessica had emailed a startup incubator in Palo Alto using a secondary address 2 weeks before Douglas made his first illegal transaction. In the message, she referenced a joint pitch deck for Miller Consulting's transition to asset digitization. I had never heard of Miller Consulting, but Douglas had once registered an LLC under that name 3 years ago. I'm planning something. Before the theft. Before Paris. Before the trap had even been laid. I forwarded the chain to Chloe with a flagged priority. The next morning, she called. "That's it," she said. "That's your breach. That deck contains monetization models built on your cybersecurity frameworks. She helped Douglas position you as a back-end architect for a product you never agreed to. Which means," I said, "which means she committed fraud using your name and your IP." I closed my eyes. She's worse than Douglas. "Douglas was a thief," Chloe said. "Jessica's a tactician. She doesn't want your money. She wants your identity, your career, your future." I exhaled slowly. "Then let's make sure she gets none of it." We built a new case. This time, not about emotion. No drama, no monologues, just legal precision. Chloe drafted a civil complaint for reputational damage and IP theft. We added backup files, trace logs, system forensics, and the metadata from the Miller Consulting draft Jessica helped create. Keller advised that if Jessica had knowingly submitted those materials using my credential, we could escalate the matter to criminal charges. Still, I hesitated. Not because she didn't deserve it, but because part of me still remembered the woman who once brought over soup when I was sick, who laughed with me about failed relationships, who for a while felt like the family I'd never had. Trust fractures loudest when it's not expected, but I wasn't naive anymore. That afternoon, I walked to the boutique cafe where Jessica and I used to meet every other Thursday. I sat at our usual window table, back to the wall, and watched. At 3:07 p.m., she walked in. She looked tired, lighter, like she'd shed a skin. She didn't see me. Instead, she walked straight to a corner booth and sat across from a man in a dark blazer. Not Keller, not a colleague, Douglas. My heart didn't race, it steadied. He was supposed to be under supervision. Community service, reporting hours. And yet here he was, leaning forward, his lips moving in tight, controlled cadence. Jessica nodded, slid something across the table, a flash drive. I stood up before I even knew I'd moved, pulled out my phone, snapped 3 silent photos, and walked out without letting either of them see me. I called Chloe as I stepped into the sun. "You're not going to believe this," I said. "He's with her, right now, at Sterling and Fifth." "Together?" she asked. "Like they never skipped a beat," I said. Then I stopped walking because a notification buzzed across my screen. "New email received, unknown sender. Subject, you missed one piece. Call me before it's too late. Attached, betrayal. Hits hardest when it comes wrapped in loyalty." I didn't open the audio file right away. Not because I was afraid of what it would reveal. Not because I was afraid of what it would reveal. Fear had stopped governing me a long time ago. But because I already knew, in the hollow center of my gut, that whatever waited inside would confirm what I didn't want to admit. that Jessica had never just betrayed me, she had studied me. I played the file an hour later, alone in my home office with the door locked and the blinds drawn. The voice was distorted but male, filtered, probably run through a masking app. But what it said didn't need a name. Miller thinks she's clean, but Jay knows the system inside out. Your code was layered into her beta firewall back in March. Phase 2 isn't about taking her down. It's about replacing her. Quietly. Let her burn the bridges while we build the exit. The voice paused, a faint laugh. Then, and if she fights, well, she signed everything. She just doesn't know it yet. I didn't move. Didn't blink. Just sat there while the silence that followed wrapped itself around me like a wire. Jessica hadn't just helped Douglas steal from me. She had been preparing to be me. Somewhere in the legal haze of consulting agreements, project contributions, and backdoor clauses, I had apparently signed off on something, maybe even unknowingly, that transferred ownership of my own IP into a shell corporation. One I hadn't created, one that Jessica likely had. It made sense now. The flattery, the constant, "I wish I were as sharp as you" comments, the quiet questions about how I structured clauses in contractor work. She was never just admiring me. She was mapping me. I called Chloe, sent the file. She listened in silence. Then, we need to go deeper. That afternoon, Chloe arranged a quiet meeting with Agent Keller at his off-site office in Bellevue. No paper trail, no official log. He reviewed the email, the voice sample, and the metadata headers. It came from a masked IP rerouted through 3 domestic servers, he said. But we already flagged one of them a week ago. Red Hawk Strategies backup subnet. Jessica had gotten sloppy. Or bold. Maybe both. Keller folded his hands. Legally, we're close. If we can prove she leveraged your credentials knowingly and used misrepresented ownership to gain funding or partnership access, we can escalate to criminal fraud. Chloe leaned in. We don't just want to expose her. We want to freeze her. He nodded. Then we need the trigger, something public, something they can't spin. A plan began to take shape. I would do what they'd always expected of me. Play it quiet, polite, harmless, then take everything from underneath them. That night, I invited Jessica to coffee. She said yes within 2 minutes. The cafe was on the corner of a quiet street in Capitol Hill, somewhere public, safe, with just enough background noise to make a covert recording undetectable. Jessica arrived 5 minutes early, which meant she was nervous. She wore her signature navy trench and oversized sunglasses, even though it was overcast, the kind of wardrobe choice someone makes when they want to feel in control or invisible. I stood up to greet her, a cordial smile, a small hug. She acted like nothing had happened. "God, Amelia," she said, brushing imaginary lint off my sleeve, "you've been impossible to reach lately. I was starting to think you were ghosting me." "Busy week," I replied, gesturing to the corner booth. "Shall we?" She slipped into the seat across from me. The waitress came by, took our orders, black coffee for me, chai latte for her, and disappeared. There was a moment of silence as we both stirred our drinks. Then I leaned in. "Tell me about Red Hawk Strategy." Jess's spoon froze mid-air. "Sorry?" I met her eyes. "You heard me." There it was, the flicker. The tiny micro-expression that passed across her face before she tucked it away under a layer of casual confusion. "I have no idea what you're talking about, Amelia. Is this some kind of tech joke?" I reached into my tote and pulled out a printed screenshot of the Shell Corp's registration. Her name was on it. Not directly, but her legal assistant's was, and her business partner's, and the timestamp traced back to the week we closed funding on my beta prototype. I slid the paper across the table. She didn't touch it. Her voice dropped half an octave. "Where did you get this?" "Where do you think?" I gave her a moment to sit with that, to calculate. "Then you used me, built a clone of everything I created, filed for exclusive licensing on code I designed before I even married Douglas, and now you're preparing to pitch it as your own." Jessica leaned back. "You're being dramatic." I raised my phone. "Still recording?" Am I? Her eyes narrowed. You're recording this. No! I lied. The air between us changed, sharpened. You think you're clever, she said, her voice suddenly cold. But if you go public with this, you'll lose more than a few friends. Investors don't back founders who cry betrayal. They want clean, efficient deals. You blow this up, you're radioactive. You already made me radioactive, I said. I'm just giving the fallout a name. Her nails tapped the ceramic cup. You always did like the moral high ground. And you always did like standing next to it, close enough to benefit from the light, far enough not to get burned. Jessica stood, tossed a 20 on the table. You want war, she said, but be prepared to burn with it. She walked out without looking back. I waited a full minute before stopping the recording, then forwarded the entire audio file to Chloe. It was enough. It was more than enough. That night, Chloe filed an emergency injunction with the Washington State Business Bureau, backed by metadata, timestamps, and a sworn affidavit from one of Jessica's former interns, who'd apparently grown a conscience just in time. By morning, Jessica's accounts were flagged, her speaking engagement at a local tech summit was canceled, and a quiet internal review had begun at Red Hawk. But the twist? Jessica wasn't the only one pulling strings. Later that afternoon, as I was filing archived emails, I noticed something strange. An outgoing message from my backup Gmail account that I hadn't accessed in years. It was dated 3 months ago. It had an attachment titled, New version, .ownership clause, final Gmail, and it had been sent to a familiar address, ethan.miller@redhawklegal.com. I stared at the screen, heart thudding. Ethan. My brother. They say blood is thicker than water, but blood also stains, and mine was on too many hands to count. The day I filed the restraining order against my own brother, the courthouse smelled like disinfectant and betrayal. The irony wasn't lost on me. Ethan and I had once built pillow forts together in the very same neighborhood where now I stood with legal documents proving he'd colluded to erase me from the company I'd founded. He hadn't just signed over proprietary code. He'd handed them the blueprint to my legacy. I walked out of the Superior Court of King County in silence, my boots crunching over the salt spread on icy sidewalks. Winter in Seattle had always felt metaphorical to me. Wet, cold, gray, honest in its misery. Chloe waited outside, a coffee in one hand and a USB drive in the other. Clean copies, time-stamped, secure, she said, placing the drive in my palm like it was a loaded weapon. I'm going public, I replied. She nodded. Then be ready. Jessica's scrambling, Ethan's in denial, and Douglas, she hesitated. He filed a petition for full rights over your joint assets, claims you're mentally unfit due to unresolved trauma and obsessive delusions. My laugh was hollow. Of course he did. I had spent years believing silence equaled survival, that if I just worked harder, stayed smaller, let their names come first, Douglas, Ethan, even Jessica, I could carve a space for myself in their world without starting a war. But I was done surviving. I was ready to start building, and so I did. By noon, I had secured an exclusive interview with Claire Hargrove, a Pulitzer-nominated journalist known for her takedowns of tech moguls. By 2, we met at an industrial loft near Pioneer Square. The moment I slid the folders across the table, financial records, email correspondences, original sketches, Claire's eyes widened. This is airtight, she murmured. They'll try to spin it. They'll say you're bitter, jealous, vindictive. I met her gaze. Then make sure the story burns hotter than their lies. The article went live 2 days later. The foundress they tried to delete. It lit a firestorm. Investors began pulling out of Red Hawk. Douglas's reputation took a nosedive when emails surfaced showing his active role in rewriting my contributions to pitch decks. Jessica was subpoenaed. Ethan withdrew from the board of directors, citing personal, and yet victory tasted like ash. Because what no headline captured What no affidavit could document was the silence inside the home I now rented, far from the Miller estate. There was no velvet furniture, no antique grandfather clock, just a small workspace, 2 laptops, a foldable bed, and a single-framed photo of my mother holding me the day I turned 7, the same year she died. That photo was the only truth no one had ever tried to erase. It was during one of those nights, alone typing lines of code for a new platform I would launch under my own name, that the doorbell rang. I froze. It was past midnight. Through the peephole, I saw her, Vivian, my stepmother, in a trench coat, alone, no driver, no entourage, just her and a yellow envelope in hand. I opened the door halfway, heart hammering. "What do you want?" She didn't step in. "I'm dying," she said, voice almost too calm. "And you deserve to know the truth. About your mother. About why I kept everything from you." I stared at her, disbelief colliding with instinct. "I don't believe you." "You will," she said, holding out the envelope. Inside was a death certificate, dated 2 years before my mother was supposed to have died. And taped to the back of it was a photo I'd never seen before. "Vivian, the master manipulator, returns with a bombshell revelation. Amelia's mother may have died under different circumstances, or not at all." I stood frozen, the photo trembling between my fingers. It was unmistakably her. My mother, but not the usual grainy portrait from my childhood scrapbooks. This was a candid, she was older, her hair shorter. Lines around her eyes that had never existed in the photos I knew. And the background? Not a hospital room. It looked like a coastal rehab clinic. "This is a lie," I whispered, not to her, but to myself. Vivian watched me closely. "Your mother didn't die in that accident. She was declared dead to protect the family name. The real story would have ruined your grandfather's bid for the Senate." I stepped back, adrenaline crashing into my ribs. "So, you forged a death certificate and let me grow up thinking, believing—" "She was unstable," Vivian interrupted. "She wanted to expose things. About Edward, about the trust fund, about what we did to get it. We sent her away, paid for her care, but when she started contacting the press, her voice broke off. For a moment, I saw something human flicker behind her polished facade. Regret or just exhaustion? "I kept the photo," she said, "because I knew one day you'd find your way back, and you'd deserve to see her as she truly was before everything fell apart." I could barely breathe. The room felt smaller, collapsing under the weight of so many rewritten truths. "You let me hate you all these years," I said. Vivian looked away. I deserved it. She left the envelope on my table and walked out into the rain without another word. I didn't follow. That night I didn't sleep. I sat curled on the floor, photo in one hand, laptop in the other, reading through the file she'd included. Medical bills, letters, notes in my mother's handwriting, shaky but real. "Don't let them tell you who you are," one note read. By morning, I had booked a flight to Bodega Bay, California. The rehab center still existed. It had changed names twice, but I'd tracked it down. 3 days later, I stood at the iron gate of St. Marian's recovery home, holding a folder of documentation and a heart that felt both full and shredded. The nurse at reception didn't recognize the name immediately, but when I showed her the photo, she gasped. "That's Evelyn," she said. "She used to sit by the piano every night, hummed that lullaby, something about stardust. She passed away last year. Cancer." My throat closed up. They had buried her under a different name. No obituary, no service, just a single line in a logbook. I asked to see her room. It was small, sparsely furnished, but her presence lingered. Tucked behind a drawer was a stack of journals. Some entries were gibberish, others were lucid. One note was addressed to me. "Amelia, if this ever finds you, Know that I never forgot. I loved you more than I was ever allowed to say. I hope you build something no one can take from you. I hope you break the cycle. I sat on the edge of her bed and sobbed like the child I never got to be. That night, I returned to Seattle with the journals, the photo, and a grief that had shape and texture now, one that hurt, but finally made sense. I didn't confront Vivian again. I didn't need to. Her silence in the press, her absence from the company board, her withdrawal from the estate litigation, it said enough, but I did something else. I registered a new corporation, one that didn't bear the Miller name. Evelyn House, a tech startup designed for survivors of fraud, abuse, and betrayal. A place for second chances. My story went viral, not because it was salacious, but because it was honest. The woman who was silenced built a company around voice, around truth. And the last time I visited Red Hawk's headquarters, it was as a guest speaker for their ethics seminar. Ethan couldn't meet my eyes. Jessica had long resigned. Douglas? Well, Douglas had vanished from public view after the settlement. Some might say I won. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like completion. I built my house. Brick by truth-soaked brick. And as I stood in front of a crowd of young women at the launch of Evelyn House's mentorship initiative, I said the words my mother once wrote, "Break the cycle." Then someone in the back raised their hand and asked a question I hadn't expected. "Are you still in touch with any of your family?" I smiled. Calm but tired. "No, not anymore." But just as I stepped down from the podium, a woman approached. Olive skin, hair pulled back, a tentative look in her eyes. She handed me a small envelope. "There's something you need to see," she said. "It's about your father." It's strange how silence becomes a friend once the noise fades. 2 years have passed since I launched Evelyn House. The world didn't stop for my story. It never does. But something inside me shifted permanently. I don't wake up with anger in my chest anymore. Grief still visits sometimes, usually in the quiet moments. But now it brings company, acceptance, clarity, and peace. Veronica moved to Arizona. Last I heard, she'd taken a job as a receptionist at a dental clinic. No lawsuits, no headlines, just obscurity. Which, for someone like her, is probably the cruelest justice of all. I didn't pursue her. I didn't need to. People like Veronica only win when you keep playing their game. Jessica sold her shares quietly and disappeared from tech altogether. Someone sent me an anonymous tip that she's working at a nonprofit in Portland. I smiled when I read that. Maybe guilt taught her something. Maybe not. Either way, I hope she's at peace. I don't think I hate her anymore. Douglas, he vanished. His accounts were frozen after a forensic audit transfers. The board expelled him. The media turned cold. He was last seen boarding a flight to Argentina. No charges, no closure, but I don't lose sleep over it. Some ghosts are best left drifting. Ethan, however, was different. He asked to meet, not to apologize, but to explain. I let him talk for exactly 12 minutes before I stood and said, "You never broke me, you just delayed me." Then I left him in that cafe, staring at the door like he was waiting for the past to offer mercy. It never would. And me? I moved into a brownstone in Brooklyn. Modest, warm, filled with books, plants, and no secrets. I started teaching part-time at a community college. My students don't know my story. They know me as Professor Miller, the woman who brings donuts on exam days and cries quietly when someone nails their capstone. Zoe visits sometimes. She changed her major to psychology. She told me, over sushi one night, "I want to help people like you." I smiled and corrected her, "Like us. We're healing together." The journals my mother left behind? I digitize them. 1 entry per week goes out in our Evelyn House newsletter, edited for privacy but full of her spirit. We call the series Letters from the Quiet. Sometimes late at night, I imagine her reading them. I imagine her seeing the life I rebuilt from the ruins she never meant to leave me in. And I imagine her saying, "You did good, kid." And finally, I believe her. Thanks so much for watching Family and Heart Stories. If this story touched you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more heartfelt dramas every week.